One day in the first week of December 1892, Emmeline Segrand sent out for the Holmeses building in Englewood, bearing a small, neatly wrapped parcel. Initially, her mood was bright, for the parcel contained an early Christmas present she had planned to give to her friends, the Lawrences. But as she neared the corner of 63rd and Wallace, her spirits dimmed. Where once the building had seemed almost a palace, not for its architectural nobility, but for what it promised, now it looked drab and worn. She climbed the stairs to the second floor and went directly to the Lawrences' apartment. The warmth and welcome resurrected her good spirits. She handed the parcel to Mrs. Lawrence, who opened it immediately, and pulled from the wrapping a tin plate upon which Emmeline had painted a lovely forest. The gift delighted Mrs. Lawrence, but also perplexed her. Christmas was only 3 weeks off, she said kindly. Why hadn't Emmeline simply waited and given the plate then, when Mrs. Lawrence could have offered a gift in return? Her face brightening, Emmeline explained that she was going home to Indiana to spend Christmas with her family. She seemed delighted with the anticipation of a visit to them, Mrs. Lawrence said. She spoke in the most affectionate terms of them and seemed as happy as a child. But Mrs. Lawrence also sensed a note of finality in Emmeline's voice that suggested Emmeline's journey might have another purpose. She said, "You're not going away from us." "Well," Emmeline said, "I don't know. Maybe." Mrs. Lawrence laughed. "Why, Mr. Holmes could never get along without you." Emmeline's expression changed. He could if he had to. The remark confirmed something for the Lawrences. "It had seemed to me for some time that Miss Segrand was changing in her feelings toward Holmes," said Dr. Lawrence. "In the light of what has happened since, I believe now that she had found out to a certain extent the real character of Holmes and determined to leave him." She may have begun to believe the story she heard in the neighborhood of Holmes's penchant for acquiring things on credit and then not paying for them. Stories that she had heard all along, for they were rife, but she had at first dismissed as gossip of envious hearts. Later, there was speculation that Emmeline herself had trusted Holmes with her $800 savings, only to have it disappear in a fog of promises and lavish future returns. Ned Connor's warning echoed in her mind. Lately, she had begun talking of returning one day to Dwight to resume her work for Dr. Keeley. Emmeline would never told the Lawrences goodbye. Her visits simply stopped. That she would leave without parting a word struck Mrs. Lawrence as being very much out of character. She wasn't sure whether to feel wounded or worried. She asked Holmes what he knew about Emmeline's absence. Ordinarily, Holmes looked at Mrs. Lawrence with a directness that was unsettling, but now he avoided her gaze. "Oh, she's gone away to get married," Holmes said, as if nothing could have interested him less. The news shocked Mrs. Lawrence. "I don't see why she didn't mention something to me about her getting married." "It was a secret," Holmes explained. "Emmeline and her betrothed had revealed their wedding plans only to him." But for Mrs. Lawrence, this explanation only raised more questions. Why would the couple want such privacy? Why had Emmeline said nothing to Mrs. Lawrence when together they had shared so many other confidences? Mrs. Lawrence missed Emmeline in the way that her effervescence and physical brightness, her prettiness and sunflower hair lit the sullen halls of Holmes's building. She remained perplexed and a few days later again asked Holmes about Emmeline. He pulled a square envelope from his pocket. "This will tell you," he said. The envelope contained a wedding announcement, not engraved as was customary, merely typeset. This too surprised Mrs. Lawrence. Emmeline would never have accepted such mundane a means of communicating news of such magnitude. The announcement read, "Mr. Robert E. Phelps, Miss Emmeline G. Segrand, married, Wednesday, December 7th, 1892, Chicago." Holmes told Mrs. Lawrence that he had received his copy from Emmeline herself. Some days after going away, she returned for her mail, he explained in his memoir, and at this time she gave me one of her wedding credit cards, and also 2 or 3 others for tenants in the building who were not then in their rooms. And in response to inquiries lately made, I have learned that at least 5 persons in and about Lafayette, Indiana, received such cards, the postmark and her handwriting upon the envelope in which they were enclosed, showing that she must have sent them herself after leaving my employ. Emmeline's family and friends did receive copies of the announcement through the mail, and indeed these appear to have been addressed by Emmeline herself. Most likely, Holmes forged the envelopes or else duped Emmeline into preparing them by persuading her they would be used for a legitimate purpose, perhaps for Christmas cards. For Mrs. Lawrence, the announcement explained nothing. Emmeline had never mentioned a Robert Phelps, and if Emmeline had come to the building bearing marriage announcements, she surely would have presented one in person. The next day, Mrs. Lawrence stopped Holmes yet again, and this time asked what he knew about Phelps. In the same dismissive manner, Holmes said, "Oh, he is a fellow Mr. Grand met somewhere. I do not know anything about him except that he was a traveling man." News of Emmeline's marriage reached her hometown newspaper, which reported it on December 8, 1892, in a small, chatty bulletin. The item called Emmeline a lady of refinement who possesses a character that is strong and pure. Her many friends feel that she has exercised good judgment in selecting a husband and will heartily congratulate her. The item offered a few biographical details, among them the fact that Emmeline once had been employed as a stenographer in the county's recorder's office. From there, the item continued, she went to Dwight, and from there to Chicago, where she met her fate. Fate being the writer's coy allusion to marriage. In the days that followed, Mrs. Lawrence asked Holmes additional questions about Emmeline, but he responded in only monosyllables. She began to think of Emmeline's departure as a disappearance, and recalled that soon after Emmeline's last visit, a curious change in routine had occurred within Holmes's building. The day after Miss Legrand disappeared, or the day we last saw her, the door of Holmes's office was kept locked, and no one went into it except Holmes and Proctor Quinlan, Mrs. Lawrence said. About 7 o'clock in the evening, Holmes came out of his office and asked 2 men who were living in the building if they would not help him carry a trunk downstairs. The trunk was new and large, about 4 feet long. Its contents clearly were heavy and made the big trunk difficult to manage. Holmes repeatedly cautioned his helpers to be careful with it. An express wagon arrived and took it away. Mrs. Lawrence later claimed that at this point she had become convinced that Holmes had killed Emmeline. Yet she and her husband made no effort to move from the building, nor did they go to the police. No one did. Not Mrs. Lawrence, not Mr. and Mrs. Peter Legrand, not Ned Connor, and not Julia's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Smith. It was as if no one expected the police would be interested in yet another disappearance, or if they were, that they would be competent enough to conduct an effective investigation. Soon afterward, Emmeline's own trunk, filled with her belongings and all the clothing she had brought with her when she left home in 1891 to work for Keeley, arrived at a freight depot near her hometown. Her parents at first hoped, she had sent the trunk home because now that she was marrying a wealthy man, she no longer needed such old and worn things. The Segrands received no further mail from Emmeline, not even at Christmas. This, said Dr. B. J. Segrand, Emmeline's second cousin, the Northside dentist, in spite of the fact that she was in the habit of writing to her parents 2 or 3 times a week. Emmeline's parents still did not imagine murder, however. Peter Segrand said, "I had at last come to the belief that she must have died in Europe, and her husband either did not know our address or neglected to notify us." The Segrands and Lawrences would have found their anxiety intensified manyfold had they known a few other facts. That the name Phelps was an alias that Holmes's assistant, Benjamin Peitzel, had used when he first met Emmeline at the Keeley Institute. That on January 2nd, 1893, Holmes again had enlisted the help of Charles Chappell, the articulator, and sent him a trunk containing the corpse of a woman, her upper body stripped nearly bare of flesh. That a few weeks later, the LaSalle Medical College of Chicago had taken delivery of a nicely articulated skeleton. And that something peculiar had occurred in the room-sized vault in Holmes's building, a phenomenon that, when finally discovered by police 3 years later, would defy scientific explanation. Somehow, a footprint had been etched into the smooth enameled finish on the inside of the vault door, at a point roughly 2 feet above the floor. The toes, the ball, and the heel were so clearly outlined as to leave no doubt that a woman had left the print. The degree of detail mystified the police, as did the print's resilience. They tried rubbing it off by hand, then with a cloth and soap and water, but it remained as clear as ever. No one could explain it with any certainty, The best guess posited that Holmes had lured a woman into the vault, that the woman was shoeless at the time, perhaps nude, and that Holmes then had closed the airtight door to lock her inside. She had left the print in the last hopeless effort to force the door open. To explain the print's permanence, detectives theorized that Holmes, known to have been an avid interest in chemistry, had first poured a sheen of acid onto the floor to hasten by chemical reaction the consumption of oxygen in the vault. The theory held that Emmeline had stepped in the acid, then placed her feet against the door, thus literally etching the print into the enamel. But again, this revelation came much later. As of the start of 1893, the year of the fair, no one, including Holmes, had noticed the footprint on the door.